Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, when it comes to these policies, I'm about as open-minded as you can get. I'm for renewables, but I understand that we cannot go from step 1 to step 10 overnight, and that fossil fuels are going to have to be used at least for a while. And so it would seem to me that we should all be working for ways to get the cost down, but at the same time, we don't want to pollute the environment, and I think that it's a very delicate balance that we have to look at. The United States obviously needs to have a national energy policy. We want to reduce dependence on foreign oil. We want to keep our districts clean, and we want to lower Americans' energy bills, and we try to somehow throw everything into the mix. But in my state of New York, we do have a model for a policy that I think could be implemented at the national level. Governor Cuomo announced the Reforming Energy Vision Initiative, which is a proposal to reform New York's energy grid by shifting away from centralized plants and instead having utility companies purchase energy from a multitude of small producers. This change would allow for greater reliance on smaller, cleaner sources and reduce our dependence on a small number of plants like Indian Point, which has its troubles very few miles from my district. So let me ask Mr. Clemmer, because in addition to the environmental and safety advantages of the governor's initiative, I believe his proposal would also produce economic benefits. Wind and solar power create jobs. So, Mr. Clemmer, could you discuss what kinds of benefits these initiatives like Governor Cuomo's proposal might yield, and might this be an approach that other states could use as well?
Sure. Good question. We put out a report in April that looked at the impacts of climate change on the electricity grid, and there's several different climate impacts that pose vulnerability, and we've seen an increase in frequency and severity of impacts that have caused power outages that have cost lots of money. And the initiative that New York is pursuing is probably more comprehensive than I've seen anybody else do, but there are other examples of states that are trying to implement similar types of programs in which obviously spending money to harden the electricity grid is important, but we also need to reduce carbon emissions as well so that we can reduce the costs that climate change is having on the grid. And so things like energy efficiency, distributed generation, solar PV, other renewables that are smaller, when an extreme weather event knocks out some facility like that, it has less impact on the grid than it does if it's a large nuclear plant or a large coal plant. And some of the recent extreme weather events that we've seen, both with the polar vortex but also with actually heat waves, have caused lots of problems with large nuclear and coal plants in particular. One of the impacts from heat and drought, which is directly related to climate change, is that those plants use a tremendous amount of water. And renewables like wind and solar don't use any water. Efficiency obviously reduces the need for water as well. So it helps reduce the vulnerability of the electricity grid to those types of impacts.
Mr. Nadel, would you essentially agree with that?
Yes, I would. New York is to be commended for really taking a lead and looking at the future of the utility industry. A lot of people in the industry are starting to think about it, but New York is really taking the lead. The industry is changing in dramatic ways, as just about everybody in industry will agree, and it's time to reform regulation to address the 21st century industry, not the 19th century industry.
Thank you. Mr. Clemmer, the Beacon Hill study has been referenced a couple of times, and I know you have some serious concerns about it. I'd like to give you a chance to elaborate on that.
Sure. I mentioned a couple of times some of the flaws in these studies, so let me just outline a few of them quickly. One is that they, first of all, assume it's going to pretty much all be wind that meets the RPS, which obviously there's other choices, but for the most part, wind has been a large contributor to the state RPSs. But they've assumed that wind costs are 2 to 4 times what the actual wind contract prices have been in the United States, documented actual real projects. They're also assuming transmission costs that are ridiculously high, 3 times as high as what projects have cost. There's a recent project that just went in Texas that's facilitating wind projects there. The assumptions that they make around the impact of integrating wind, which Mr. Tanton has referred to several times, are way overblown. Wind does not need one-to-one backup for all of its generation. It does provide mostly energy to the system, as he said, but there's been studies by regional grid operators, utilities all over the country looking at 20 to 30% renewables from variable sources that have shown very small costs for doing that, because utility grid operators have been doing this for decades. They have to manage the variability that comes from demand, from other power sources going offline, and there's systems are built to accommodate that. And so as we move towards more natural gas, that actually increases the flexibility on the grid to accommodate more renewables. And so those are just some of the assumptions that lead to really, really high cost estimates from their studies.
Thank you.
Can I respond a little bit?
Yes.
I think too often people equate price with cost. Yes, the prices paid to wind developers are low, but that doesn't mean that the costs are low, because other people are paying the cost. We refer to transmission costs, but keep in mind when the capacity factor for wind is only 30%, the capacity factor for that associated transmission is also only 30%. That will easily triple your per kilowatt hour transmitted cost.
The gentleman's time has expired.